While all 9 Supreme Court justices agreed Trump should be on state ballots, there are questions that remain unanswered. That includes the possibility Congress could refuse to certify the election of Trump or any other presidential candidate it sees as having violated Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The chair of the UMaine Political Science Department said the case itself is unique, given it's the first of its kind.
There was some disagreement on some of the details, and then there was also some things the court just didn't weigh in on, right? So we still don't know the answer to the question of, is the president of the United States, for purposes of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, is that office considered an officer of the United States? We don't know the answer to that.
Brewer noted another takeaway from the ruling is the 14th Amendment requires Congress to act before the insurrection clause could be used. In other words, Congress would have to enact legislation that would allow Section 3 to be used. While most of the justices agreed Section 3 is not self-enforcing, the 3 most liberal justices said the court went too far in determining what Congress must do to disqualify someone from federal office.